Um, and allow me to start. Thank you all for joining. Thank you for participating in today's conversation. I hope I am audible enough so that I may continue. Please give me a thumbs up. Okay, thank you. So to just start off on today's conversation on transnational organized crime in Africa with a particular focus in the Horn of Africa. I would like to welcome you all. And I know people are joining us from different geographical locations. So it's a good evening from me. Good morning, good afternoon to everyone who is joining us, depending on what's your location. And my name is Janet Sankale. I am the Kenyan representative for the Horn of Africa Institute for Peace and Security. The Horn of Africa Institute for Peace and Security is a nonprofit institute working to promote peace, security, and inclusive governance across the Horn of Africa. Through its research, dialogue, and training, as well as digital platforms like this, Peace Talks, we call it the Peace Talks, we aim to bring practitioners, policymakers, communities to shape solutions to the region's most pressing challenges. And I want to welcome you all, and we are excited to have you join us today on this critical conversation on transnational organized crime in Africa. And our focus today will be, we'll speak generally in Africa, but we'll also focus on the Horn of Africa, as that is our mandate. And we will look at the current trends, impacts, and some of the regional responses. So before I go further, I would like to just please note and state a few housekeeping rules. So this session is being recorded, and I think if the team can help me record. Oh yeah, it's recording. So yeah, this session is being recorded, and the session is 1 hour, 30 minutes. Please, you can share your question, comments, reflections on today's conversation on the chat box, on the Zoom chat box at any time. Please feel free to share. And also, please keep your microphone on mute unless you're invited to speak. And we call this is a safe space for us to learn and dialogue. So let's be mindful and respectful of to each other. And thank you all once again for joining. But before I bring on board the speaker for today, we are privileged to be joined by a very experienced and brilliant mind on board on this topic. So just to bring on the context of this transnational organized crime, and this is a very complex phenomenon, not only in Africa, but globally. And Africa being the second largest continent after Asia, it's known for its rich mineral resources and biodiversity, but with this comes with its own pros and cons. So the cons are it has become a transit hub for many criminal networks, from human trafficking, drugs and arms smuggling, environmental crimes, illicit and financial flows. And in fact, according to reports, Africa's locations make it ideal for illicit material from moving from Asia to South America to Europe and to North America. And according to the latest data index by the Global Initiative, which was released actually last month, it reveals that organized crime has surged across Africa since 2019, while its efforts to combat it has weakened. And the index further describes or reveals that 92.5% of that is almost the all African countries, if I may say, 92.5% of the countries of the African countries are characterized by having low resilience to organized crime, with 23 of the countries are affected by devastating combination of high criminality and low resilience. And the most pervasive criminal markets are financial crimes, human trafficking, non-renewable resource crimes, and trading counterfeit goods and arms trafficking. So when we come closer to home, that is the Horn of Africa region where we are focusing our conversation on. So the data index also say that the East Africa, which actually mostly comprises of all the countries, or almost all the countries in the Horn of Africa region, and our speaker for today will be able to speak about it more in detail. The East Africa stands out for high human trafficking, arms trafficking, and human smuggling, with Kenya, where I am based actually, as the financial hub for East Africa. So many countries or the Horn of Africa is marred by conflict, and many countries with the highest criminalities scores are plagued by conflict and insecurity, by conflict and instability. So making it more creating an environment for these crimes to thrive. Even the coups in the in the Sahel, West Africa, and the Horn of Africa, which we actually know that Sudan has experienced coup and is in active conflict, creating this instability is where these transnational crimes thrive. And the growing convergence between transnational organized crimes and terrorism has increasingly been evident in various parts of the country, and most of it in the Sahel region and the Lake Chad basin, which are mostly affected by terrorism. So as we reflect on this, and as we now welcome our speaker, and where we'll be able to learn from our guest, who has much of his experience or primarily focused on transnational organized crime. Our speaker for today is Dr. Phil Williams, who is a professor emeritus at the University of Pittsburgh, where he taught from January 1990 to April 2022. During much of this period, he directed the Ridgway Center for International Security Studies and held the Wesley W. Postvoch Chair. In the first part of his career at Aberdeen University, Southampton University, and Chatham House, he wrote books on crisis management, the Senate, and the U.S. troops in the Europe. And with Mike Boker, Superdedent, during the last 30 years of his research, he has focused primarily on transnational organized crimes, and he has written on this in Survival, Washington Quarterly, the Bulletin on Narcotics, Scientific American, Crime Law and Social Change, and International Peacekeeping. Dr. William also wrote and edited several monographs for the Strategic Studies Institute and at the U.S. Army War College, including criminal militias and insurgents. He has also written on organized crime in Iraq and the Dark New Age. Dr. William, together with Dr. Dayton Fidner, co-edited a volume on cyberspace, malevolent actors, criminal opportunities, and strategic opportunities. Most recently, Dr. Williams also has co-edited with Michael Glass and Taylor Shaybolt on urban resilience and security, governance responses in the Global South, and published by Elgar in January 2022. And his latest book with Colin Clark and Jason Blazakis, The Mediterranean Connection, Criminal Networks and Illicit Economies in the North Africa, was published by Lynn Rayner in 2024. And in November 2024, he also published a report titled The Fifth Wave, Organized Crime in 2040 for the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime. With that extensive bio, allow me to welcome today's guest speaker, and then he will be able to share his presentation and share his insights and experience on this topic. So welcome on board, Dr. Phil Williams. Welcome.
Sorry, I've got a phone going that I can't stop. Right. Well, thank you, Janet. First of all, thank you to Isaac and his colleagues for inviting me to do this. It's been a pleasure and a privilege to work with them. And thank you, Janet, for moderating and doing such a good job. You were very nice about my bio. Um, and I was thinking back many years ago when I first started, I was invited to give a guest lecture, and the host said to me, "Do you want a serious introduction or a knockabout, a humorous introduction?" And I stupidly said a humorous introduction. So his first words were, "We were looking for a serious expert on this subject, and we couldn't find one, so we ended up with Phil Williams." So I hope you don't feel like that today. When I finish, I'll try to give you some expertise. I will see if I
Okay.
can share my screen. And as I said,
Yeah, please.
so if I can do that, it's not working for me.
When you press the share button, what's coming up?
Uh, the desktop. I
Yeah.
think that,
So where is your presentation? You can click on where your presentation is and then share.
okay. Okay, I think I can. Does that work? Can you see it?
No, not yet. Okay, yeah, it's coming up now.
Right. Okay. Thank you. Okay, so let me start again by saying what a pleasure it is to be here. And right.
Yeah,
So
that's perfect.
so let me start with the agenda. I want to make some disclaimers, assumptions, observations. I'll then talk about the smuggler's toolkit. This is something I developed some years ago. Then I'll talk about governance and its challenges, and in a very generic way. Then I'll briefly go over some country surveys, and then some responses and recommendations where I have some ideas about how we can attack organized crime more effectively. So I should start by saying I'm not a specialist, right? Uh, but I do try to have a global perspective. In the last few days, I've read a book of 19 chapters on Vietnamese organized crime. And I have to say, it was extremely good. Um, and I was impressed by the way in which the authors put together some existing criminological concepts, but linked it to the peculiarities of Vietnamese organized crime. And that's what I try to do. I try to do deep dives, but then maintain a global perspective. I also try to give some frameworks for analysis about how we think about this. So one point I often make is that academics get too focused on their models, and they think their models are the only ones that really exist, their favored ones. In fact, for criminal organizations, there are multiple models. You can have hierarchies, networks, families, brokers, fixers, state, state embedded organized crime. And I think it's really important that we recognize the diversity of all these groups and avoid intellectual straitjackets. The other point I want to make is I think a very important one. We often treat organized crime as if it's an outlier. In fact, it's not an outlier. Organized crime benefits a lot of people. And when I say that, I'm often not popular. I once said that about 25 years ago, at a Marshall Center conference in Germany, and people were not pleased. But it does. If organized crime didn't benefit a lot of people, it would be much easier to deal with. But it does benefit people. And Daniel Bell, an American sociologist, in the 1950s, described organized crime as the queer ladder of social mobility. He was talking about the United States, where Irish groups, Italian groups had all come and gone into organized crime, and their communities had profited as a result. And I think Bell's comment about the queer ladder of social, and I would add economic mobility, is a very important bottom line for us. I think organized crime often too provides alternative governance, and I think that is particularly important, particularly as the state often leaves governance gaps. Final point in terms of basic assumptions is that organized crime, for all intents and purposes, is borderless, although it can use borders defensively, but law enforcement operates in a world that is still bordered. Okay, this is just an outline of the book. I didn't know a lot about organized crime in North Africa when I started it. It started as a consultancy, worked for Colin Clark at the Sufan Group, but I ended up working about 3 years on it, and I think we produced something that is very good. Again, drawing heavily on the global initiative and the work on North Africa by some of the scholars. The global initiative was outstanding, gave us a great base from which to start. But this is how we structured the analysis. Basically, we tried to have each chapter on each country chapter looking at governance and criminality, where we drew heavily on the Bethman Transition Index and the Global Initiative. Then we did chapters to the extent possible, made it quite uniform from one to the next. So some observations to start. And I think, Janet, you captured this beautifully. We have a global space of flows, and the Horn of Africa is part of that, with its strategic routes. Gulf of Aden, Red Sea, Yemen in particular adds to regional stability. I always remember when I first started this, talked to a scholar called Peter Lupsha. He said, if you want to understand organized crime, think about ports and harbors. And he's absolutely right. They are some of the main transshipment points for organized crime. Conflicts become all about war profiteering and add to the complications of governance. I draw a distinction between home states, host states, transshipment states, and service. That's something I developed again some years ago, and I think it's still useful. There's an obvious distinction between smuggling, which is a crime against the state, and trafficking, a crime against the person. Unfortunately, we don't have coherent responses to transnational organized crime, but we tend to get fragmented responses. Finally, I just want to mention on this slide, a subtle trend. I've worked on money laundering on and off for many years, and along with three colleagues, did a study for UN, I think around 2000, on offshore financial centers. But I think money laundering is increasingly being replaced by what I like to call commodity laundering, where you take illicit commodities or commodities that have been mined illicitly, and you integrate them into legitimate supply chains. So from the start, you basically have laundered the products. You have no need to launder the profits, right? You've already laundered the commodity. So I think that's quite important. The other thing I think is going to happen, and I talked about this in the thinking about 2040, essentially we're going to get much more murky markets where there's a mix of licit products and illicit, and a mix of trafficked and smuggled. And this tries to summarize that, and you can read it at your leisure, because I believe everyone will get a copy of this. So let me turn to Smuggler's Toolkit. And I think there are different ways of smuggling goods. And a book I greatly recommend is I Am the Market, is the title of the book. And I think it's very well worth reading. Anyway, I would argue there are four things you can do to smuggle and to traffic things, right? But concealment is a very obvious one. And the Cali drug trafficking organizations in the 80s and 90s were brilliant at this. They would take cocaine and put it in cement posts. They would soak the cocaine in leather and cardboard and then reconstitute it at the other end. And concealment works because it's easy to embed illicit goods in the vast number of licit goods that are being moved all around the world. Deception is all about the papers. So false bills of lading, counterfeit passports, falsified end user certificates, those are good examples of deception. Circumvention, basically the avoidance of the former ports of entry. You saw this a lot in the United States, where people were just coming into the country, carrying drugs, and coming across the borders, but avoiding the former ports of entry. And I think that's important, and we see that in borderland regions. And also on borderlands, there are arbitrage opportunities, right? And I think an awful lot of smuggling goes back to arbitrage and different commodity prices. But the result is a thriving cross-border trade. So the final one is facilitation, bribery and corruption. You can read that. Sometimes looking the other way is enough, but essentially you get close, often symbiotic relations between criminals and government officials, and that facilitates smuggling. Corruption can be both a condition and an instrument, and I think that's an important point to note in passing. So that's a smuggler's toolkit. So let me turn now to governance, and I would argue that only about 20 to 25% of states in the world are strong and effective. There are an awful lot of weak states which suffer from these deficits, these gaps, have low levels of legitimacy. They don't have the capacity to extract resources and taxes or provide for their citizens. We see in a lack of consensus on the fundamentals. We have a big problem with that in the United States right now. Some states are exclusive rather than inclusive, as we're seeing with all the concerns and the growth of right-wing governments in response to irregular immigration. And then neoliberalism, this idea of neoliberalism, basically said the state should get out of the way for the market. And that encouraged the abdication of state responsibility to its citizens. So drawing on that, here's a table I developed. Think about the capacity gaps. Gaps lead to functional holes. And the functional holes provide opportunities for organized crime, right? And I've got how each capacity gap and functional hole leads to certain opportunities. So the poor immigration system, the fact to be very restrictive, means irregular migration increases. And then human smuggling and trafficking become growth industries. Okay, some working assumptions about governance. There's a close relationship between poor governance and organized crime. Weak states, authoritarian states, corrupt states, perfect breeding grounds facilitate organized crime. And the capacity gaps tend to be filled sometimes by organized crime, which produces alternative governance. My favorite example of that was a group in Guatemala called the Lorenzanas. It was a family group, and they were drug traffickers, but they were also the major patrons in the region. They provided flood relief, jobs, medical clinics, gifts for children at Christmas. They were the patrons, and DEA took them down. The Drug Enforcement Administration took them down, which was great in terms of combating drug trafficking, but left a huge governance gap, and the state didn't step in. So good governance requires a lot of balancing acts, and you can read these faster than I can go through them. But all these things have to be balanced, right? Top down versus bottom up, and so on. The governors and the governed. How do we balance people's multiple roles and identities? All these things require a lot of balancing acts. And that's not an easy task. Many states don't manage them. In too many cases, the state is the prize of politics. So if you become in charge of the state, you have all sorts of access to resources that you can use, sometimes legitimately, sometimes illegally. And increasingly, and this is a term developed by the Global Initiative, there is state-embedded organized crime. So these are some governance challenges that I see in your region, right? Political corruption, lack of transparency, tensions between different branches and levels of government, conflicts that have overlapping and destabilizing ripples, conflicts create enormous opportunities for profiteering, and insurgencies challenge legitimate governments. So all these things are at work. Okay, given that, here's the scores for Kenya criminality. I know there's resilience, and Jana talked about resilience being the other part of the balance. And the Organized Crime Index looks at both criminality on the one side and resilience. I just don't have time to deal with resilience. So these are the key criminality scores, and I'll go over the countries in that order. And let me go back one. Okay, I missed that, but basically I was saying how much I've drawn on the Global Initiative and the BTI. They are fabulous sources. I've summarized in what I talk about for the countries. I summarize the country studies, mainly from what's provided in the Organized Crime Index with some other sources as well. Okay, let me start with Kenya. You're the criminal actors, right? Criminal gangs, state-embedded actors, mafia groups, and network groups. So those are the categories. They appear in most everything. But let me start with criminal gangs. In Kenya, major diverse landscape of criminal groups, many of them in urban areas, often entangled with local and national politics. In 2006, I went to Jamaica, and it was interesting. All the Jamaicans were talking about the Dons. And when they were talking about the Dons, they weren't talking about Dons as godfathers. They were talking about Dons as basically community leaders, but also as godfathers. It was this curious mix of the two. And I think this gang entanglement with political parties has also occurred, I think, in Kenya. Gangs are very resilient, highly adaptive, and they fulfill certain functions for the political parties. So here are some quick comments about them: the concentrations, the informal settlements around Nairobi, and local assessments, right? So, and again, for gangs, a lot of it is about extortion or protection. In Mexico, it's called controlling the plaza. But where you demand protection payments, it's just ultimately a form of extortion. So organized criminal gangs have been around now in Kenyan politics for a long time, often linked to politicians, but back to that ladder of social mobility. And think about gang membership, what it provides: a sense of belonging, a sense of status, and a sense of power. I remember looking at or reading a chapter about gangs in Cote d'Ivoire, and they were known as the microbes, and they were predominantly 8 to 10-year-olds. But the gangs empowered those kids, and they often became the breadwinners for their parents. So gang membership is important. And some gangs are very sophisticated, others are very simple. sometimes what they do is very hard to distinguish from ordinary crimes. The Mungiki, obviously one of the most enduring. Extortion and protection of their bread and butter. But you also see everything from street crime to cyber fraud and exploitation of children. Drugs, Kenya, transit country for heroin. Corruption helps. Heroin is also linked to these other crimes. In addition, transshipment country for cocaine with Nigerian and Italian groups, particularly the Ndrangheta involved. Kenya is a hub of cannabis cultivation and increasingly synthetics. Human trafficking and human smuggling, source country, transit country, and destination country. There's a trafficking route. Much of it's done through fraudulent employment agencies with fraudulent documents. These are some of the people who are exploited. And you see this transshipment hub for human smuggling to the Gulf and the Middle East. Also, I think some concern in Kenya for growth of child sex tourism. Arms trafficking, linked to conflict zones, linked to cattle theft, linked to Al-Shabaab, and can have pernicious impacts. Natural resources, again, these are very quick summaries. But trafficking of lion or hippopotamus and lion products and donkey skins, illegal sand mining. One of the big surprises in the book on North Africa was illegal sand mining in Morocco, and it's a huge problem. I don't think it's quite as bad in Kenya because it's mainly, I think, inland with inland rivers rather than on seashores. But again, it is a problem and something we neglect. But it's a problem in many parts of the world. Cyber crimes, foreign actors, obviously, ransomware attacks, crypto fraud, credit card fraud, counterfeiting of pharmaceuticals, all those things go on. So let me turn quickly to Sudan. I'm not going to try all these countries, it would be too long, but I will go through Sudan very quickly. Criminal actors, in many ways, this reminds me a lot of Libya, okay? You have the RSF versus the Sudan Armed Forces, both engage in crime as part of their conflict to try to make them win the conflict. Then there are looser networks with human trafficking and smuggling, state-embedded actors, and foreign companies. Drugs, heroin, cocaine, cannabis, synthetics. Synthetics are emerging as a major problem globally. I think we've seen a gradual transition from botanical drugs to synthetic drugs. Human trafficking and smuggling, again, exacerbated by conflict. And the one problem with human smuggling is people who are smuggled voluntarily can too easily become victims of trafficking. And I think that's a huge problem. Arms trafficking, again, lots of foreign weapons. Demand has surged because of the conflict. And you've got the gold trade linked to arms trafficking. Natural resource exploitation, illegal logging, charcoal, gold smuggling, Russian-linked groups, again, fuel shortages, again, very similar in bizarre ways. Fuel smuggling, a lot of that in North Africa too. The one good thing, foreigner trafficking has declined because of the conflict. Cybercrime is limited in Sudan, but financial crimes are widespread because of the corruption, and you have a lot of embezzlement and misuse of funds. Okay, Somalia, I'll go through Somalia fairly quickly, then jump over the other countries. But criminal actors, Al-Shabaab, obviously the biggest player. The IRA, once someone wrote about the IRA and they said they had the Capone discovery. The IRA in Ireland, the Irish Republican Army, became very good at extortion. Al-Shabaab is very good at extortion. Other groups do the same. Al-Shabaab also involved in poaching of elephants, ivory, smuggling. And then you have looser criminal networks as well. Now, one of the things that there's a big argument about, or at least I think there's an argument about, is the relationship between terrorists and criminals. And many people think it's that line between organized crime entity and terrorist entity. They think that's the biggie. I don't. You do get examples where terrorists and criminals cooperate directly, but I think the big one is terrorist entity, the diagonal line to organized crime activities. And we've seen that with Al-Shabaab, we've seen it with ISIS, we've seen it with Al-Qaeda, we've seen it with FARC in Colombia. Terrorist and insurgent groups use criminal activities to fund themselves. Now, one example that people often quoted was cocaine going through the Sahel, and how cocaine going through the Sahel was an example of terrorists cooperating with criminals. In fact, I don't think it was. You all remember the brand new movie, The Godfather, make him an offer he can't refuse. And then Mokhtar Belmokhtar was one of the people in the Sahel who made sure that he gave the cocaine traffickers an offer they can't refuse. And what was described as protection and cooperation was really extortion. Okay? State-embedded actors, a problem, particularly with Al-Shabaab infiltration. You have transnational criminal networks, particularly Iranian nationals. Then you get North African traffickers involved and lots of illegal fishing. So Somalia really has its share of problems, many of which come from outside. Here's the quick one on drugs. I'll let you glance at that. Just look at that. Again, seeing this interesting shift to synthetics. Human trafficking and smuggling. Again, a lot of it going to Europe, the Gulf, South Africa. A lot of smuggling, as I say, again, turns into trafficking. And that's just some points about the routes. This is a part of a study that Isaac sent me about human smuggling and how the smugglers operated. It's fascinating, and I think Isaac would probably be willing to send it out to people. I found it incredibly informative, and it just showed some of the reasons. And a lot of it, again, goes back to the fact that organized crime, if you look at the top right, and to make some extra money and better paid jobs, right, that is all about organized crime being a queer ladder of economic mobility, to go back to that comment. So arms trafficking, charcoal still a problem, frankincense harvesting, cheetahs being trafficked, gold mining, problem everywhere, and then the illicit fuel trade. All these problems come together. Ethiopia, I'm going to go through very quickly. In fact, I will let you look at that. The same with Djibouti. And the same with Eritrea. Eritrea, I think, is, oops, sorry, I've overrun. I need to go back. So, okay, let me go to some of the responses. Right. So here's some responses. Essentially, some things we need to do in response to all of this. First one, I think, a far more cooperation in the Horn. I know there's But again, I think it's important to get more cooperation. Nikos Passas, who's an old friend of mine, is a brilliant guy. He talked about criminogenic asymmetries. And the more you get laws, rules, and regulations and taxes harmonized, the more you reduce the opportunities for organized criminals. Commodity laundering, I've already talked about. We need to rethink some of our categorizations and think much more in terms of criminal alliances and criminal coalitions.
Sorry, Dr. Phil, you muted yourself.
Okay. Is this okay to go on this one?
Yes, yes.
Okay.
You can start from we lost you when you were just starting the responses and recommendations. So you can just start from there.
Okay. Okay. So let me go back one then. No, I'm going the wrong way. Okay. Right. Okay. So basically, rethink some of our categorizations was the final point on there, right? So risk management strategies. They are very important, and we should think about how we can exploit them. Criminal organizations develop preventive strategies, defensive strategies, and mitigation strategies. So how do we counter those? Transparency, investigative journalism are critical for anti-corruption. And I think protecting journalists and protecting NGOs is critical if we're going to get anywhere against organized crime. Think about how do we attack criminal organizations? What are their points of maximum vulnerability? In Clausewitzian terms, what are their centers of gravity? Often I don't think we do that. I'll show you a risk toleration pyramid in a moment. And then I'll show you different kinds of networks and how we might attack them. Am I okay for another 5 minutes? Janet?
Yeah, sure. You can continue just when you're winding up. You have some time. Yeah, you can continue.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so this is something I developed in 1995, and I was doing some consultancy work. And the guy, I was writing these things, and a guy called Don Gordon, who was brilliant, retired colonel. I showed him this, and he said, "Now I know why I'm paying you." And he hadn't been impressed with anything I'd written, but he liked the diagram. Okay, so this is just a drug trafficking organization, right? And it started with thinking about the big ones. But what do you attack? You attack personnel, products, and you attack money laundering. The bottom three. That has very little impact, right? Because personnel, it's easy to get new couriers, new drug mules. Products, you just produce more. And laundering, some of your money gets seized, but not a lot. What you've got to really go after are the top three. You have to go after the profits, try to shrink demand and supply. You have to go after the organizational structure, and you have to go after the leaders. And the US eventually did this in Colombia when it took down the Medellin drug trafficking organizations, Pablo Escobar and his colleagues, and it then took down the Cali drug trafficking organizations, the Oruella brothers in Santa Cruz, Londonio. So my argument is think about, with a holistic strategy, where do you go? And you really go after what's in red on that diagram. Okay? Does that make sense? Okay, now I developed a network typology. A core network is top down. A mesh network is bottom up, if you like. And above this line, above the middle line, are organizations and then individuals. So a core network, you can attack it in certain ways, and you attack each of these in different ways, right? So a core network, you try decapitation, and you try to remove what are called the critical nodes. Okay, so you try to take out people who are critical. It might be the financier, it might be the chemists who do the mixing, right? So you take up those critical people, the critical people who are at the intersection of the licit and the illicit. For example, back in the 1990s in Mexico, the president's brother was a consultant for transnational organizations, but they were transnational criminal organizations, and they had one product, and that was white powder. It was cocaine. And he ended up with 133 million in Swiss bank accounts for helping them and protecting them. So he was the critical node. You take people like that out, and it becomes much harder to deal with them. For mesh networks, which are not top down, they come together, they converge. They are basically networks without hierarchy. Again, you go after the critical nodes, but you also attack critical process points. So again, DEA did this very successfully at one point, where they took out some guys who were the intermediaries between the Latin American drug traffickers and fishermen. And they took out the key people. And that led to a backlog of cocaine for several months till they could reestablish that linkage. It was a point where the critical node and the critical process of moving the drugs converged. For brokers, these are individuals. You try to remove or discredit the brokers, but you have to do more than one because another one can always step in. And then flex networks, these existed in the Netherlands. They were described in the Netherlands in the 1990s. And it turns out it's 3 or 4 people coming together for a criminal activity, working together, breaking apart, working with somebody else. Very hard to infiltrate. And it turns out, according to a study by Damien Zach, it turns out that Colombian drug entrepreneurs in the Netherlands were also part of these small groups that were constantly changing and evolving. So somehow you've got to try to keep these people out of it and create new barriers to entry. But that's very hard. They are the hardest. The flex networks are the hardest to deal with because they are so fluid, so dynamic. Okay, thank you so much for listening. I hope that was useful, and I look forward to questions and discussion.
Thank you so much, Professor. Clearly, I can call you Professor. It was a learning class for me. And thank you for sharing that comprehensive overview and analysis on the global perspective of transnational organized crimes and also focusing on the Horn of Africa. I mean, you have clearly demonstrated that, the gaps, or you've demonstrated that these crimes are on a very governance-centered lens. And most importantly, how deep these crimes are embedded in our political, social, and economic structures. I can agree that the Horn of Africa is a critical function as a very critical space of flows, serving as a critical transit and a service hub for drugs, arms, people, illicit commodities, financial crimes, because of its geographical location and the porous borders. And also the active conflicts, especially in Sudan, and the protracted conflicts in Somalia, South Sudan, and the fragmented also governance in those countries. And we have also witnessed we have witnessed that some of the states in these regions exhibit authority deficits, lack of good governance, or that political will. And also they have a limited capacity in dealing with such crimes, organized crimes. Some are too big and the resources are not available. And also the state themselves lack legitimacy, and also the exclusion in politics. I mean, there are so many contributors to these crimes. And I like how you explained the concept of the smuggler toolkit, and how these criminal markets are facilitated and shaped by this toolkit. including concealment, deception, circumvention, corruption, facilitation. And you have also well explained of how we need a balancing on good governance. And you have stated examples there of how gaps in governance contribute to these crimes, like lack of inclusivity, consensus. And you've given also good example case studies on different countries in the Horn of Africa. You've described the relationship between terrorism and organized crimes. And I agree, it's not an easy task to combat these crimes, actually because of its highly complex nature, and it's a challenging global issue, even to the highly developed worlds, countries. Um, and how also I would like to bring also the fact that technology has also shaped how these crimes are taking place now, and where people are able to move swiftly without any restrictions. We are able to expand their reach and they move across borders using technology, hiding their identity you're unable to predict. And I agree that a lot has to be done. And thank you so much again for that comprehensive lesson for me, and maybe to most of the listeners and participants in this session. But before we move to the session of Q&A, I would like to invite a very special person to this conversation. And I had highlighted about the report, last month report on the data index on Africa, organized crime. So allow me to call on Miss Julia Stanyard, a senior analyst at the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime, and she will be able to share her insights on the topic. I hope she is here and she can hear me.
Yes, I am. Thank you very much, Janet.
Thank you. Welcome.
Thank you. Thanks, Janet, for the introduction. And thank you, Phil, for your presentation, which was incredibly wide-ranging, I must say. So thank you for that. Janet and to colleagues had asked me to contribute to the presentation, just really to respond to what you'd been saying, Phil, and to speak specifically about the tool which Janet mentioned just now and in the introduction, the Global Organized Crime Index, which is a tool that my colleagues and I have worked on, and Phil also used in your presentation. It's very good for us to see that it's turned out useful for others who are working on the same field. So thanks for that. Just to introduce myself and our organization a little further, because I imagine that there will be many in the audience who may not have heard of us before. But the Global Initiative is we're a think tank, we're a research organization. We work, as the name suggests, globally all around the world. And we do research on the current trends in organized crime and also responses to it. Our research, which is available on our website, I'll put it in the chat afterwards, really aims at both shedding light on different forms of organized crime, and often this information often very difficult to come by, but also providing policy recommendations for governments and other organizations to use as well, so we can move towards a more evidence-based response to it. So in essence, that's what our organization does. The Organized Crime Index is one of our kind of flagship research projects, and I'd just like to share my screen as well so that I can show you what the index is and how we can use it. Because as I understand it, there are a lot of practitioners on this call, other researchers, people working in this space, and hopefully this is a tool that will be useful for people. Janet, can I just check that you can see the screen?
Yeah, sure. We can see it.
You can see the map on the screen. Okay, sure. So to explain a little more what the index is, Through the index, we try to gather as much as possible, all the available information on organized crime, whether that's qualitative other research reports, our own research, media reports, reports put out by governments, and try to put that into a quantitative model. It's global, it's the big picture. And what we're trying to do is, put a lot of granular information into a way that can be understood through numbers, essentially through a scoring system, which allows us to rank countries, compare trends across countries as well. So this is, based on our own research, but also a lot of other literature and also expert consultation as well, by which we kind of rationalize the different scores and make sure that the rankings reflect the nature of the evidence on the ground. To explain the scoring a little bit, the index measures two things. First, we aim to measure the levels of criminality within a state, and the second is state resilience. So by levels of criminality, I'd just like to go into, say, take Somalia, for example, to explain what we're measuring here. So the criminality scores, as you'll see here, it measures a different range of criminal markets, quite a wide number actually, for everything from human trafficking and human smuggling to arms trafficking, non-renewable resource crimes, which includes things such as illicit gold trade, a number of different drugs markets. And we've recently included a couple of categories on cyber-dependent crimes and financial crimes as well. It also tries to measure different forms of criminal actors, mafia-style groups, state-embedded actors, foreign actors, and private sector actors as well. In terms of resilience, which is the other part of the index scores, what we're trying to measure here is how states can respond to organized crime and their capacity to do so. So that covers everything from legal and judicial frameworks and their functionality, victim and witness protection, and other measures as well, as you can see on the screen. So we've now had 4 different iterations of the index. This comes out every 2 years. And so through that, we've now got several years of data that we can look back on. And so this now allows us to see kind of emerging trends in time across the region. We're looking at the Horn of Africa today, but this is, of course, a global tool. So what we can see, as for example, the graph on Somalia shows, we've got data looking back to 2019. So we can start to see now for which countries criminality has risen or fallen over time, in which categories that has happened, and the same for resilience. Has that improved or has it worsened over time? So to look a little bit at the trends that the index data has now captured in the Horn of Africa, these are some of the things which Janet and Phil, you've already discussed. But as Janet highlighted, actually, some of the majority of countries in the Horn of Africa fall within the category of having both high criminality and low resilience, and this is actually a continent-wide trend we see across Africa. But our finding from the data in the region is that this gap is widening. We're seeing increasing criminality and decreasing resilience. This is primarily driven by the 2 countries that I've highlighted on the screen here, both Ethiopia and Djibouti. So Ethiopia's criminality score rising we scored it at 4.58 in 2019 to 2025, it's risen to 6.03 out of 10. So that's an amalgamation of all these different categories put together. The particular drivers that we see in Ethiopia, we've seen in this time a surge in issues such as kidnap for ransom and also illicit gold trade. And at the same time, you've seen decreasing resilience, which is primarily driven by increasing regional conflict within the country. The same goes for Djibouti. You've seen an increase in criminality and also a corresponding decrease in resilience. Within Djibouti, what we're seeing here is particularly the use of the country as a waypoint for illicit transfers of goods such as weapons. By contrast, the other countries in the region of the Horn, Eritrea and Somalia, have both remained relatively static in both their criminality and resilience scores. So this is how we'd like to present the the index data from the Horn of Africa currently. But to look a little bit further, slightly beyond the region, we also see the same trend of high criminality and low resilience for some of the key neighboring countries to the Horn. Obviously, you've got ongoing conflict in Sudan, which has significantly driven a decrease in state resilience within Sudan and driven demand for example, illicit weapons. And then you see the same in Yemen. The reason I'm bringing this up here is that criminality in the Horn of Africa is particularly tied to its neighbours, as Phil and Janet described. It's operating at the confluence of regional trade routes. So say if you take arms trafficking, for example, one thing that we've covered in our research is, of course, that you see transfers of weapons going from Iran to Yemen, also then spilling over into Somalia. So the ongoing conflict within Yemen, demand for illicit weapons, is having a knock-on effect within the Horn of Africa. And that has continued to develop further. UN panel of experts reports, for example, most recently highlighted increasing coordination in arms supply routes between Houthis in Yemen and Al-Shabaab. So we see that regional interconnectivity developing further. So to conclude, one of the main conclusions from our analysis of the Organised Crime Index in Africa, I'm just highlighting the report on the screen now, was that criminality thrives in volatile and unstable environments, and we see a particularly high connectivity between conflict and forms of organised crime within Africa, and the Horn is no exception to that. I will share these resources in the chat, but please, anyone feel free to reach out if you have any more questions about our methodology or how we reach these conclusions. And finally, to say thank you all for being here, and thanks very much for the invitation to speak.
Thank you so much, Ms. Julia, for sharing those insights and your remarks on the globe. And we appreciate the Global Initiative for its extensive and rigorous research and highlighting these crimes and how your strategies in reducing global harm and building resilience. We hope you are staying. If not, we'll not hold it against you.
No, of course, staying for any questions that might come up. Thanks very much.
Yeah. Okay. Thank. I will come the question and answer session a little bit later, but I want to still as we are at the report and just using my privileges as a moderator here, I just want to ask on this how you arrive or how you come up with this data. Do you use like police reports from grassroots organizations, and just to build this data? Because I'm thinking there might be maybe areas or maybe there are no reports from the police, so how those data are not in place. Yeah.
Mm. Yeah,
If you
no,
could
absolutely.
explain that also, and maybe just you can follow up with this other question where you can respond maybe your years of experience in this data analysis, and how would you frame or how would you tell between your previous report and the current report? Is the crimes are increasing? I know you have shared data on how low on the criminal groups and the resilience part, but is it increasing? And the response, are there any improvement, or it's just weakening and there's no maybe room for improvement? Yeah.
Sure. Thanks, Janet. I mean, as I think I mentioned briefly about our research methods, but just to go over again, we draw, the first port of call is our own research and our own team of researchers who contribute everything that they can to the index. But then we also draw on a wide range of other literature, other research reports, UN reports, reports, for example, which are put out by police and by states, and gather all that information together. And try and cross-reference between these different sources to get the most reliable information. As you said, this is not something organized crime by its very nature. As you're studying it, it's not something where there is always a huge amount of available data. That's why we have to go out and supplement it with our own research as well. But that's what also the beauty of having a index which is updated over time means that the evidence base is always growing stronger, and that's what we're trying to bring into the tool as well. The final stage of the methodology also includes kind of expert consultation. So we gather all the available evidence, put that into an initial set of findings, and then consult with external experts who review, much like an academic study, that they'll provide peer review comments and so on, which are then incorporated. So it's trying as far as possible to measure something which is inherently difficult to measure. And so we will always recognize the limitations on the tool, but it's trying to condense a very wide range of sources into one score essentially. And your second question around what are the overall trends that we're seeing. Yes, particularly a worsening in forms of organized crime, which are particularly linked to conflict. So there are certain types of crimes that we see are accelerating across the region. While we do highlight that state resilience, I'm looking particularly at the Horn of Africa now. State resilience as a whole, appears to be weakening. There are, of course, several examples where, in isolated areas or particular topics, where state resilience has strengthened. We measure things like states' adherence to certain forms of international cooperation, which allow, a response to organized crime across borders. Transparency initiatives, building sort of states' capacity. So, of course, there are many examples where state resilience has improved. Unfortunately, the overall trend we're seeing is a decreasing one. So, thanks.
Thank you to Ms. Julia. We hope you stay in case participants have questions to ask. Please let me remind you to type your question on the chat box. And before I go again to this Q&A session, I am privileged, I am informed by my seniors that we are privileged to be joined by Lieutenant Colonel Sadiq Aden Ali, who is the current Operations Deputy Director for Somalia Police Force. I hope he's here and he can hear me. Would like to hear from
Janet,
you.
go ahead.
Welcome.
Thank you very much, Janet. First and foremost, thank you very much. I really appreciate you, all of you, and and good evening for all of you, and also all protocols observed. Allow me to thank Professor Phil Williams and Mrs. Julia for very insightful and very resourceful presentations concerning about the fields of work and what has been happening already so far in the area of work. These presentations had sharpened our knowledge on transnational organized crimes, and also appreciate to Madam Janet for your role of moderator. Lastly, the team, Institute's team, for inviting our guys and us. Thank you very much. When it comes about the points that has been already mentioned by the professor and Professor Reza, Madam Julia, really was representing the issue that has been already facing by the world, and especially in the continent of Africa. When it comes about the Horn of Africa, especially in this region, Western Africa, we can easily mention that it's in danger and already struggling with this transnational organized crimes. When it comes about cross borders, example in Somalia, when it comes about cross borders, when it comes about conflicts and migrations, that the migration is the reason that has invited migrations, or the migration is the one invited conflict. Which one should come first? Also, the points that needed to be highlighted when it comes to transnational organized crimes. Again, lack of populations. My experience in Somali police force, I can easily mention with the lack of some areas, some countries, or some countries, lack of legalities that can be managed. For example, when it comes about human trafficking in Somalia, we normally manage the outdated laws of Immigration Act, which prohibits someone to go out from his country to another country irregularly, or without a proper way of traveling. When it comes about trafficking in persons and smuggling of migrants. Again, when it comes about drug dealing, some countries could be origin countries that drugs can be transferred from, For example, in Somalia, I met with one case study that Somalia was originating country. Some 2024, I remember a case study that someone has concealed sweets items locally, protected sweets into some drugs and narcotics, and has been traveled, sent to Saudi Arabia, which lastly becomes to be captured and bring him investigated and prosecuted and bring him in the courts, in front of courts. Again, when it comes about human trafficking, Somalia mostly is a country of origin, and also it's a country of transit. Sometimes when it comes about east route and north route, Somalia sometimes become a transit country where some, our fellow Africans, especially Eastern Africans, traveling to Yemen, Somalia will become a transit country. When it comes about those other routes in northwest, Somalia is also originating country that travels to the Mediterranean Sea and to Europe. This is the most points of transnational organized crimes, and has been invited by weak of institutional regulations. For example, terrorism, as the professor had mentioned, was the biggest problem that has invited, transnational organized crimes when it comes about, irregularities, or crimes that have been criminality in Somalia. Lastly, Somalia, in terms about this case study, Somalia has suffering like was other countries in Africa or in the world, is suffering this transnational organized crimes. But what we can think we can be sometimes, in my experience in Somalia, I can mention what makes Somalia to be much tougher than other countries is the lack of weak of institutional capacities, lack of sometimes legalities or regulations that can be controlled. And I think mostly in drugs that the professor had mentioned, some drugs could be cocaine. We didn't come. We had the information and reports and cases, but exactly in tangible examples, we never met with cocaine in the region. But when it comes about terrorism, and for example, in southern parts of Somalia and other countries in the region bordering with Somalia, Shabab, the biggest problem that mentions and holding back this country to be developed, and ISIS also in Western region. So when it comes about the porous borders from Yemen, and how arms are being smuggled to Somalia, drug trafficking, human trafficking, all that things, we are facing a lot of that things. So this is all about my comments, and I would add, the time, we are running out of time, I think. So I could have planned some questions with the professor, but this is all about the comments that I do have. And really, I appreciate it. Thank you, Julia, Professor Bill Williams, and Janet as moderator for a few. And the participants of the rest of the team, I also congratulate them and say them thank you very much. Thank you for all of you. Thank you, madam.
Thank you, Lieutenant Colonel. Maybe we can start with your question. We still have time till 7:30. So if you have any question, you can just ask them directly to Dr. Phil.
Janet, could I ask Julia a question?
Okay.
Julia, thanks for that presentation. I thought it was brilliant, and I wish you'd gone before me, actually. That would have made a lot of sense in retrospect. But the one I have problems with, right? I love the Organized Crime Index. I used it in the North African book. Mark's an old friend of mine from the 90s, so it's really great to see the work you guys have been doing. The ranking that doesn't make sense to me is Eritrea, right? It's your lowest, I think the lowest or second lowest in terms of the Horn, and it's a criminal state, right? If we're honest about it, and a couple of people have asked questions about Eritrea in the commentary box. So I guess that's my worry. For me, the numbers and the reality for that country and the rest, I think you're right on the mark. I thought your discussion of trends was brilliant. But how do you explain that?
Yeah, thanks, Phil. I think Eritrea is a really interesting example for precisely that reason, is that, and this is why whenever I'm doing a presentation about the index, I often start off with a discussion of how it works and exactly what we're scoring, because The index, when it's measuring criminality, it tries to measure both a range of different criminal actor types. So that includes like mafia groups, criminal networks, criminal actors that are embedded in the private sector, and state-embedded actors as well. And then it's also measuring a range of different illicit markets as well. So everything from human trafficking, human smuggling, arms trafficking, drugs, cyber, financial crime, etc., etc. I can't actually remember off the top of my head now exactly how many different criminal markets we measure, but I think it's around 14. And the interesting characteristic about Eritrea is that it's in some aspects incredibly high criminality. Like you say, it scores very highly on state-embedded actors for precisely the reason that you mentioned. The state is heavily involved in criminal activity, but also its forms of criminality are very concentrated in a couple of specific markets. So that is primarily also human trafficking and human smuggling. That is often the smuggling of migrants who are leaving Eritrea, includes many people who are escaping conscription, for example, and those migrants often end up being trafficked because as they go into human smuggling routes, they then end up being exploited by criminal networks who hold them to ransom, who extort them and their families and their wider networks for money. And because Eritrea's criminality is so concentrated in one particular type of actor and one particular criminal market, it doesn't score highly on the other aspects. So which can lead to some surprising results. The methodology is not infallible, but that's why. Whereas other examples, so take the Horn, the Lieutenant Colonel was talking about the trends that he's been seeing in Somalia, which is super interesting. But Somalia scores quite differently. It scores very highly for extortion because of the role of Al-Shabaab in extorting in commerce in the territory that it controls. It scores very highly on arms trafficking. It scores very highly on migrant smuggling. It scores very highly on human trafficking. So because of the diversity of illicit markets, that actually ends up scoring higher overall. But I totally understand your point about Eritrea. It's a particularly interesting example. So yeah, thanks, Phil.
Thank you. John,
Thank you, Julia. Sorry?
there was a question.
Yeah. So I want to go over the question, if that's okay. Yeah, I can go over the question. And I think one question that has come up here, I'll address it to Julia. And if you can just, I know the Global Initiative has done extensive work in sharing the data and looking at various different years on how these criminal activities are engaging or are rising. But how do you translate these data into actionable results or outcomes in case of informing maybe states on policy recommendations on how to address the issue of organized crime? I'm just wondering, because do you work with also with other civil society organizations to inform to use the data to inform on policy recommendation? Yeah.
Mm. Yeah. Absolutely. That's actually very much central to our work. And if you look at any of the reports we put out, they often and almost always include a set of recommendations at the end. So whatever particular issue that we've done some research about, it always has to inform policy. That's our aim, and that's our kind of raison d'etre as an organization. In terms of working with other civil society organizations and other organizations working on this same sort of area, yes, absolutely. To take one example, one of the major projects we've been working on over the last 8 years, which has actually just come to an end, has been the ENACT project, which has been about enhancing Africa's response to organized crime. That's the main aim of that multi-year, multi-country project. And within that, we were partnered with the Institute for Security Studies, which is based in Pretoria. I'm sure many people here will be familiar with it, and Interpol. So that was really trying to make sure that all our research was, directly translated into policy recommendations, and the results from that have shown that to be the case. So thanks.
Thank you so much, Ms. Julia. Dr. Phil, I'd like to address a few questions to you, and maybe you can respond them in order, or you choose whatever order you want to respond to. We know that the Horn of Africa is marred with conflicts, and we have seen that these crimes thrive in those settings, instability, and where conflict is involved. I want you to give us an overview of how these conflicts fuel these crimes in the region, and is this conflicts by design so that these other crimes, as you said in your presentation, that these crimes benefit some of the people. That's why they are still there, and it's hard to combat them. So is this conflict by design to enable or to create this space for this organized crime? And another question is that how do you the correlation between these foreign companies and the state? Are these foreign companies that are available or are in this region helping in maybe enhancing military response, enhancing creating, maybe building the economy of the country? Are this are these also foreign, or is that relationship between these foreign companies and the state? Do you think that the state are much obliged to obey to these foreign countries, to welcome, to create, and then create this form of, or create this avenue to deal with illicit trade, illicit financial flows? Yeah, those two questions. I can go to the next after you respond to them.
Okay. I'm not sure the conflicts are by design, right? I think but organized crime is a product of those consequences. So the way I described Iraq, because I did a monograph on Iraq when I was at the Army War College, and what was interesting was Saddam was the godfather. The godfather's toppled, and all of a sudden you get a democratization of organized crime, and it spreads. And it started with copper, and the US had downed a lot of the pylons, and a lot of the pylons had copper in them, and the copper was stolen, and it was incredibly difficult for the United States to get the electricity grid, operating because so much copper had been stolen. But it also provided that environment that they had in Iraq without Saddam, and with a coalition authority not being that effective, and then basically getting rid of the Ba'athist army. All of a sudden you had a lot more different enemies, and you had all sorts of opportunities. So Jaish al-Mahdi, the Mahdi army led by oh God, I'm blanking on the leader, but the whole Mahdi army, the Sadrists, led by al-Sadr, they became very good at kidnapping. They became very good at oil theft. And a lot of the oil was actually stolen from the big oil refinery in the country. And that oil was on the black market. It was stolen by the Sunnis, but ended up on Shia forecourts, in Shia-owned gasoline stations, but not in the gasoline in the pumps, but in big bottles of gasoline, and so that was kind of interesting, right? So there were all sorts of opportunist criminal activities that then became enshrined in organized crime. So kidnapping for ransom became a biggie, and we think of it as being all about executions, which sometimes it was, but a lot of the time it was about money. And then we when we get ISIS in Syria. Interestingly, doing the deal with Lafarge, Lafarge paid ISIS off, and that led to subsequently some lawsuits. But I think the crime grows out of the conflict, and I don't think the conflicts are by design. But we also have to think about post-conflict. What happens post-conflict? And I think one of the things you saw in the Balkans and elsewhere is when the conflict ends, many of the same players adapt quickly and engage in organized crime, including infiltrating the reconstruction business. Right? So I think that's important. In terms of the foreign companies, are they helping? I think many of them, particularly the Russians, are very exploitative. And I think, you know, they've engaged in interference in various cases. But I don't think they're helping at all. I think they're basically looting African resources. And so I tend to be very skeptical about those. There was one other question uh, in the comments that I'd like to address quickly, and that was about
Okay.
securitization. Someone asked a question about Barry Buzan's work on securitization, and it's an interesting question. What is the best response to organized crime? Is it through law enforcement or is it through national security? And this debate is really really prominent in the United States right now, because the US has been bombing supposedly drug boats, and they probably are in many cases, but been blowing them out of the water. In the past, it was always they were arrested by the Coast Guard, the people on board were arrested, the guns were confiscated, but now they're killing them. So it's a national security response, and the administration is saying this is all about national security, and they've called them narco-terrorists, and the terrorism bit doesn't fit. Because they're not terrorists, they're narco traffickers, they're businessmen, illicit business, but businessmen nonetheless. I think law enforcement is the better response to the two. Sometimes you do need a military response, but by and large, it's law enforcement that actually upholds your laws, upholds the integrity of those. And it's still tough. I mean, organized crime becomes deeply embedded. The state-embedded organized crime, which the global initiative has really made prominent. And I work with Walter Kemp, and we talk a lot about this. Roy Godson 25 years ago, talked about the political criminal nexus, right? It was a great term. And I think state-embodied organized crime is really a reflection on the modernization of that term. But I think ultimately it can only be law enforcement responses. And then I think you've got to do other things like, as we've talked about, I think what Julia's mentioned about resilience is critical. The more resilient, the better. And for me, a key part of resilience is good investigative journalism. And I think journalists are really on the front line in the fight against organized crime and need to be protected. I think a priority of law enforcement should be protecting investigative journalists. So I hope that answers the question too.
Yeah. And just to add on the part of investigative journalists doing their job, but how do you address in countries where they silence dissent? For example, Eritrea. I mean, when I was working with my previous organization, working with the Horn of Africa, it was difficult to get information on human rights violation on Eritrea. So how do you address the states that they silence dissent? So you can't get information, you can't actually address anything. And on that, there's a point you said where in your presentation, cutting off the key people on the transnational organized crime. But we have seen examples where, for example, if I may say, Osama bin Laden, who was the leader of Al-Qaeda, but they still exist. Cutting off these key people, is it efficient? Does it help, or how does that work? Yeah.
Okay, there's a huge debate about decapitation. If you take out the leader, that supposedly works well. It doesn't always. You sometimes can get a worse leader, right? And so I'm very skeptical about decapitation. Now, I do think it's important to go after critical nodes, and they can be leadership nodes, but they can be operational nodes, they can be intelligence nodes, they can be people, particularly in the organized crime business, people who are at the margins, what I used to call the gatekeepers at the margins of legality and illegality. People like Raul Salinas, I mentioned, the president of Mexico's brother, who protected drug traffickers. Those are the people you've got to get rid of. They are very hard. And then you get rid of some of the people who produce critical functions, right? You go after the chemist. You go after the guy who acquires all the precursor chemicals. So you have key targets, and we should be doing very selective targeting and trying where we can to do multiple examples. One of the problems with Al Qaeda is you get one leader replaced by us. The third in command in Al Qaeda was killed about a dozen times, right? There was always the third in command. He'd be killed, there'd be another third in command. So you have to try to take out nodes which are, in a sense, indispensable and have few substitutes. If there are multiple nodes doing the same thing, you have a great deal of redundancy, and it's very hard to destroy the organization. But if you have nodes that are unique and critical, then they are the people to go after. Right? And on journalism, I mean, the thing about journalists is they're incredibly brave. Right? One of the things as an academic I've always hated is when academics who can be very pompous say, well, that's only journalism. Well, those journalists are on the front line and are risking their lives in a way most of us as academics don't. Right? So I think we have to get credit to them. And we saw that in Russia in the 90s under Putin. Right? Journalists would be brave and then would be killed in an attempt to silence it. And it's very hard to combat that. But I think journalists and sunlight is one of the main antidotes to corruption.
Thank you so much, Dr. Phil. And I think now, as we wind up, maybe the last question, how do we ensure good governance when there is lack of political will? And in cases where these criminal markets or criminal activities offer some degree of stability in a region or in a community, or create like a buffer to these economic declines. How do we address that?
Okay, my view is that organized crime is not only pernicious, it can also be benevolent. Right? People hate me saying that, but I think it's a reality. I mean, as a takeaway, I'd say think about the benevolence of organized crime. Think about who benefits from it. And often it's people who otherwise would be totally marginalized. One interesting thing, I think, is when you get an informal economy, people often go from the informal economy, which is at the margins, to the legal economy where they can do much better.
Yeah, very true.
So this is, organized crime as the queer ladder of social and economic mobility is one of the realities. And I don't think we should ever forget that. This is not just evil. This is not just malevolent. It's also positive with lots of benefits for a lot of people. And I hate to say that, but I think it's a reality. I mean, Pablo Escobar, right? Pablo Escobar had a program called Medellin Without Slums. And I remember seeing a documentary where a woman had, a picture of the Virgin Mary on the mantelpiece. Next to it was a photo of Pablo Escobar because he had paid for the house she was in.
Yeah.
So sometimes alternative governance can be better than bad governance by the state. This is heresy, but what the hell?
Okay, so the issue, let's speak on the issue of governance. When there's lack of political will, how do you address?
Yeah, I don't think you can. I think this is the problem. The bad governance is the root of it all. And we're seeing, and I want to be careful here, but we're seeing many norms of good governance in the United States being breaking down. Things that have never happened before are happening, and it's very hard to combat it. And this is why the United States, I think, is so polarized right now. So it's not an easy one. I don't think there are any simple solutions. It often requires, I mean, one of the things that's been very good traditionally in the US government was a thing called inspectors general. And an inspector general would be in each department, there would be multiple ones, and they made sure that the main participants, the key leaders in those departments, acted legally. And interestingly, a lot of inspectors general have been fired within the last year by the administration that came into power in January. So again, it's a problem. You need checks and balances. You need constraints. You need to shine light on it. So I don't see it improving anytime soon. I'm a great pessimist when it comes to governance. And that's why I'm saying I think in some cases, alternative governance at the local level can be the answer to poor governance or absence of governance by the state. Sorry, that's not a very satisfactory answer, but.
No, but yeah, at least it contributes to the fact that we need community engagement and community mobilization to actually address these issues. So I think we are now past time, 10 minutes past time, and I would like to call this a close. So I think everybody here can agree that this issue needs needs a holistic approach to combat these crimes. We need to strengthen our cooperation, either regionally, internationally. We need unified legal frameworks. We need to build capacity to bolster security organization. We need community sensitization to reduce victimization. We need also to improve on our economic policies because you get most of the people involved in this crime because there's no alternative. So we need to improve on economic policies to eliminate factors of criminal behavior and also improve on our transnational technologies like the digital security systems, surveillance that can also help fight these crimes, electronic crimes here, like fraud, money laundering, and all that. And also I think there is need for enhancing our national police and judicial systems and capacities and improving on our financial and resources. And if we can get training or financial resources in terms of helping investigating these complex investigations and prosecutions. And also we work with the civil society organizations. Let's work with the civil society organizations who can help in sensitizations in the community level, workshops, training, and also they can help in lobby preventive legislations and act as monitors to government accountability. And I think with that, we need to extend or further this conversation in different levels. Maybe we can have another session on this topic. We can create training. We can offer workshop on this, or even collaboration with other partners who we can also, so that we can sensitize on these issues and on this and enhance our state response or regional even response to these crimes. So I would like to call this evening an end, and this session was very insightful. Thank you for Dr. Phil for giving us that overview and breakdown of transnational organized crimes in Africa, and even you have touched on examples outside Africa. Thank you so much for giving for your time also and sharing your expertise and experience with us. And I would like also, on behalf of the Horn of Africa Institute for Peace and Security, I would like to thank the management, thank my seniors, and thank you thank my supervisor, And thank you for my team also. I know they are on the background. I like to call them Joki, Aya, Mariam, Abdi, and my boss, Isaac. Thank you so much for giving us this platform to engage with practitioners, policymakers, stakeholders, and also foster a dialogue with them. So tomorrow, I would like to announce tomorrow we have another session on climate change, drought, and security risk which will happen at 5 p.m. East African time or Somalia time. And it will be glad to have you join us. Everyone who is here can join us tomorrow. Thank you for joining us today. And I guess see you there. Thank
Janet,
you.
thank you so much. And I think you should do the talk next time. You were brilliant. One of the best chairs I've ever seen. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Phil. Thank you.
Thank you,
Bye.
everyone. Bye. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Again, I begin just. And what have you got away? Yeah, Kagari. That's all.